Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Application Security Podcast. This is Chris Romeo. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Security Journey and co-host of the podcast. I'm actually flying solo today, but I'm excited to be joined by Alex Olsen, and we're going to talk about something that's near and dear, talk about a couple things that are near and dear to my heart: security champions and security training. Alex, whenever we start an interview, we always dive directly into our guest's security origin story because our listeners, no matter where they are sitting on the literal edge of their seat waiting to hear how you got into security. So how'd you get into security?
Well, thanks for the introduction. My way in, unfortunately, is pretty typical and not too exciting. So as many people in AppSec, I started my career as a dev. So, I had a dev job out of university. And then I did move into information security first. So took a slightly more hands-off, looking at policy, governance, helping organizations try and get some of their things in order. So trying to bridge that gap between the technical world of security and the business need. And then worked for a few different organizations, big and small. I've been part of a two-man security team at a reasonably large organization. And that's kind of a double-edged sword because you learn a lot of things because you have to do everything, but it's also very stressful because everybody expects you to know everything and do everything. So I'm grateful that I put my time in, but I'm not sure I'd do it again. I definitely lose a few hairs in that kind of setting. And so since I was a dev, AppSec's always been my, I would say, strong points. Done a little bit of penetration testing, now part of a much larger security team at a tech company called Rakuten. And basically looking after the secure development lifecycle, security champions, cybersecurity training, and quite a few of the other services that Rakuten basically provide as an internal service to development teams.
Okay, so I know that a few Rakuten people, including yourself, did talks at the OWASP Global AppSec APAC edition here a few months ago. And there was a term that was used, democratizing AppSec. And it seemed like it was, from the Rakuten blog post I saw that we'll put in the show notes, it was kind of how you interwove your three talks together under this heading. And so I've heard other people use this term, democratizing AppSec, but I want to get your take on what does that mean from your perspective?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a few things that go into it. The first is who's really responsible. So if I have a development team and they want to build something and release it, they're responsible for the security of that. Now, obviously, we have internal regulations that say, hey, you have to do X, Y, and Z. These are the minimum requirements, basically compliance. But ultimately, if your service is breached or if something bad happens, the security team is not responsible. It's your service. You have to look after it. And so I think, given that that's the case, and probably rightly so, what we try and do is make sure that services that the business need are not necessarily owned by, but are built around teams and what they need at, let's say at every step of the typical development lifecycle, that they have the tools and services they need that are relevant to them and ones that they want to use rather than services that we want them to use. So as an example, let's say a lot of teams come to us and say, hey, we want to do threat modeling, or we want our architecture looked at. So there's kind of two ways we could go about this. We could be like, hey, okay, come to us and we'll give you a report. We'll do an architecture review. Or we can say, okay, we can do training and we can do an architecture review for you to get started. But then, every sprint you can revisit your threat model and then you can kind of keep it up to date. And basically that pushes the ownership of that service or that security process onto development teams, and then they can take that, adapt it, make it what they need it to be. And I think for me, that's really ties in very closely with the shift left philosophy. And that's basically what it is. So instead of us telling teams, you must do this, it's more like, okay, let's collaborate together, create a service that works for you and meets the organization's security requirements, and we'll help you do that. But really giving them a lead role in that, not just, do this because we said so. So, because we're not the police. And I think that comes up. I say this a lot in meetings, actually. We're not the police. We don't own the risk. So, it's...
Yeah. So I guess what's the trade-off then when it sounds like what you're describing here is, developers and development teams own a particular service. They're given some span of control. So in this concept of democratizing AppSec, do they still have to use a standard set of tools that you provide that are part of your SDL, or can they freelance everything along the way as long as they're within a certain kind of wide set of guardrails, or how much freedom do they actually have?
So in terms of like the development lifecycle, if they want to use a particular tool, they're welcome to do so. They don't have to use the tools that we provide. So we kind of have like a dual offering. Some services are fully managed. So you tell us, we'll scan your applications, we'll give you the results, and we'll automate that and do it on a schedule. Or we'll provide you with a nice containerized scanner that you can deploy, integrate into your pipeline. Because we have a lot of different development teams on a lot of different technology stacks, we basically kind of have to provide both of those services. But if a team comes to us and says, hey, I really want to use X scanner instead of Y, and there's a good reason, we're not the police. We can't really say no. And there are some minimum requirements. So, for example, to launch a service, you have to pass what we call a pre-release audit, which is basically a penetration test. So you have to come and do that. There are some non-argument things. But in terms of the development lifecycle, we have waterfall teams, we have agile teams, we have teams following completely, their own style of development or development lifecycle. And some teams have 50 devs, some teams have 1, or some teams now have 0, unfortunately, but the application still exists. I think we have a lot of flexibility in terms of what you're doing during development until you get to those later release stages where you need to pass your pen tests, or you need to do your patching and things like this. And in that case, we basically have my group, and we kind of act as consultants. So, we might not be able to turn something around within, a day, but if a team comes to us and says, hey, we want to use this tool, we need some help integrating it though, they can put a ticket in and we'll support them with that. So, we have architects, DevSecOps engineers, and security engineers kind of on hand to deal with those types of requests. But I would say 95% of the time we have enough coverage in terms of the tools, and the tools are quite mature now, so that actually it's easier for them to kind of follow what we have. And that's the service we want to give. We want people to want to use our services. So that's like, the ideal place to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love the idea that your statement is, we're not the police. Because so many programs I see, they could say they're not the police, but effectively they are. They are the police because they can stop deployments, they can be a roadblock. And this idea, what I'm hearing in democratizing AppSec, is it's really about partnership, collaboration. It's not like it's a free environment where they can choose whether they want to do the right security things or not. They still have to do the things. You're just giving them room to do them creatively the way that they want to, as long as they meet that goal of passing that audit. Sounds like it's a better way to give developers more room for what.
And I think there's a lot of passive benefits to that as well, because we have better working relationships with the teams, and again, there's no confusion around who owns what or who's responsible for what? Because I've been in I was at a conference maybe a couple of years ago now, a virtual conference, and somebody was saying, as a member of the security team, if I pick up something on the web server, I'll shut the server down. And I'm like, whoa. You shouldn't. That's not your server. You can't just go and shut things down. So it's really important to understand and meet each other halfway.
Yeah. So the kind of primary thing we want to talk about here is security champions, and I guess before we kind of dive into that, I'm curious, how'd you get into security champions? Did you just kind of fall into it? Like they said, hey, everybody, we need a volunteer, and everybody else took a step backwards, and you were standing there in front of the group going, wait, what just happened? Or, how'd you get into or get connected to this idea of champions?
Yeah. So, the security champions, it was actually an initiative that already somewhat existed before I joined, my current organization. So, it went back, it was under a different name. It used to be called Systems Security Lead. And they had the responsibilities were a little bit different. Basically, because there are hundreds of development teams, you need somebody on each team to assign vulnerability tickets to. Otherwise, they just sit there and nobody takes ownership of them. So I think that was basically the original use case is somebody needs to be responsible for findings, and we need to know who to chase. And this was maybe 10 years ago. I've seen documentation going back for a very long time. So this kind of idea of security champions maybe existed a long time ago, but wasn't very mature at the time. And then let's say about 4 years ago, so I've been looking after cybersecurity training and expanding that. And I think security champions being probably they attend a lot of our training, come to a lot of, they test a lot of our tools. Naturally, I had a lot of day-to-day connection with the security champion community. And so I basically said, okay, let's revamp, because a lot of teams didn't have security champions. Some of them were assigned, but, we were incommunicado, could never get hold of them, and things like this. So I think from the top, there was like hey, can somebody, do something and revamp this? And I was probably just in the best place to take it and run with it. And we did a whole revamp, and we changed the name as part of basically like the relaunch and the expansion. And at the time, it was an empowerment activity. So it wasn't mandatory. Not every team had to have a security champion, but I changed the group regulation to basically say, okay, every development team must have an assigned security champion, because I think for it to work, especially in the way that we intended, where we have at least one connection to every development team, we needed to make sure that everybody was, every team was on board. And that's probably like the one governance part of our security champions program. We do a lot of empowerment stuff in that, hey, there's this training if you want to do it, or these extra tools that we're testing that you don't have to use, but they'll give you some benefits. Come to our threat modeling sessions if you want to. So the assignment is mandatory, but a lot of the other stuff we do is basically come if you want, but we're not going to force you.
What's been your response or your experience with that? Because, when I've talked to folks about starting new champions programs and stuff, this is kind of the voluntold versus volunteer stage. And I've seen in a lot of different security champions programs, I've seen them kind of broken into three phases, with a number of iterations of the three phases. But it kind of starts with a small group of people who have a little security spark that are your initial champions. You go to the voluntold phase where it's like, hey, we need to have a champion from every unit of the business, whatever that unit is, product, business unit, whatever. And then you reach this stage where people start to volunteer, and they're raising their hand going, wow, I see the value in this champions program. And so, but I think of that voluntold portion as sometimes a struggle, because I get people they're don't really want to be there. They just, their leaders pointed at them and said, "You're our champion, go forth." And they're like, "I don't care about security," or whatever these people are doing. So what's been your experience with that as far as people being voluntold to be a champion?
Yeah, so I suppose that in our case, we have a mixture of, we do have a group of voluntold people who are basically assigned because it's a regulation, but a bunch of people who also, enjoy and proactively contributes as well. So, but going to the voluntold side, it really depends on, the classic answer, it depends on your organization and culture and things like this. I'm a really firm believer in that having good onboarding training and having good orientation and connecting with people on a, face to face. I know that's not always possible, but as close as you can, will get you off to a really, really good start. The worst thing is, imagine if you're assigned a security champion, you don't really know what your responsibilities are. You maybe join a webinar or some kind of lecture where you don't really want to ask too many questions, and then you get radio silence after that. I mean, you're never going to really contribute, right? So you need to pull people into the community, make them part of it. How we do that is we do have our orientation training, and then we do have like a open chat room where anybody can ask any questions. And when there's activity in there, people see that and they think, oh, it's okay because this person's asked where are the latest crypto guidelines, or this person's asked this question about this tool. If you have that kind of open communication, that really helps. Something that I think a lot of people have struggled with in terms of launching a security champions program or initiative is that if you try and get a champion from every business unit, their requirements or their needs are very different. So we're very specific in that development teams and developers are our security champions, mostly because we have a separate information security team. They deal with policy and compliance and governance, and we deal with cybersecurity, so technical stuff. So we're very lucky in that point of view where I can spend all my time talking about cool technical things and really deep diving on scanners and taking devs issues and helping them. But if I had somebody from accounting, for example, I'm not sure what I would tell them. I'd be like, try not to click on any phishing links. I mean, beyond that, I don't really know what to teach them. So I think our program is very focused, and I think that's a real benefit or a really good thing. That's not to say that you can't have a diverse security champions program or you can't have different streams, but I think it's difficult to make that work.
Yeah, I've seen champions programs that focused on non-developers, but it was using a lot of the same strategies that we use to work with developers, but just different content, different kind of things we're asking them to do. So I think the overarching structure works. It's just different. You're just going to be having different activities for them to perform as they make their way through. So when I'm listening to kind of you're describing an onboarding process for how you counter this idea of voluntold, and I think that's a really interesting way to approach it. It's not really, I've never really thought about or instituted an onboarding process where I was specifically thinking about how am I going to draw these people into, putting myself in their shoes for a second. Like you said, they're brand new. They get thrown into a webinar. They're like, what are these people talking about? I don't want to be here. How do you engage them and bring them in? So I'm going to add that to my tool belt, my security champions tool belt, this idea of onboarding and some different levels of being able to onboard there. I think that's a very valuable step to connect them to the community and make them feel like this is I'm home. I'm not an outsider here. I'm part of this thing.
Yeah, and at the very least as well, it gives them a good baseline in terms of clarifying. Somebody might have been like, hey, you're a security champion. And you as a dev might have been like, well, what do I have to do? And then your manager's like, I don't know. So it really clarifies kind of like what's expected, what services are available, what support's available, where to go, and also puts a name to a face as well. So it's a big organization, so I try not to do it too much. When I get requests, I'm like, you need to fill in this form, raise a ticket. But with our security champions community, we kind of make an exception to that and be like, you can direct message me anytime, and the engineers who are basically monitoring the chat or supporting the security champions program, again, kind of adopts that approach in the they're like the face of our organization. So you can direct message them and it's not a problem. We're never going to be like, just go away or pass you around to 5 different people. Yeah. So yeah, we try and create that approachable and I think approachable feeling for devs and new security champions.
Keep security top of mind with continuous application security training for your developers. Security Journey offers bite-sized lessons with hands-on interactive training for all roles in the SDLC. Give your admins the ability to use pre-built or custom training paths with easy-to-use tracking and reporting. Visit securityjourney.com to see our solution today.
So when we think about like scope, cost, and effort, levels of effort involved in a champions program, I think we've talked a little bit about the scope already. That's kind of been interwoven into our conversation about, the right distribution for champions. But what about from, I think one thing that we never talk about in the world of champions is like, what does it cost? What's the budget requirements? Because we tell people, and I tell people all the time, you need to start a champions program. I never tell them how much to budget to do that and what the level of effort should be from central security team's perspective. So what are your thoughts on kind of cost and level of effort to make this thing successful?
Yeah. So, obviously it depends on the scale. And you have items that are, some things just cost money. So it could be licenses, could be a training platform, could be, if you're set up and let's say like your security champions are the one who's, running vulnerability scanning, for example, you'd need a license for every security champion. So there are like items that depends. But, to basically run, we have somewhere between 300 and something security champions. I think it basically takes 2 full-time employees to run that community. Now that's kind of like spread over a few different people, but basically in terms of headcounts, 2 full-time people is a good estimate. Now, whatever that costs within your region, at least that gives you kind of a headcount. But this scales as well. So I suspect that actually running a security champions program that has 30 security champions is probably a full-time job. If you're doing monthly update meetings, if you're doing the reports, if you're answering questions, if you're trying to improve services, if you're doing awareness, if you're doing all of the things that, contribute to I'd say a fairly large scale, security champions program. But a lot of those things scale quite well. So we do our monthly update meeting, for example. Everybody comes along and we present on different topics, open vulnerabilities, changes to services, new training, things like that. The cost of doing that doesn't matter whether you have 300 people or 10. So a lot of stuff scales really well. So from that perspective, the cost is quite low. So I'd say between 1 and 2 full-time headcounts for probably that is most security champion programs. If you're in a really large organization, 100,000 people, then who knows? It really depends on many things. But to give some scale, my organization is about 20,000 people and about 300 security champions. And yeah, it's about 2 people. Yeah, and I think some of the other items are if we want to do new training, for example. If you have a dedicated training team in-house, like we do, we build a lot of our own contents. We use a lot of things that we've seen from within the organization to do that. Again, it just costs us time. But if you're going to pay an expert to come in and deliver training, that's quite expensive. So, if you're going to do like a week's training with 30 people. I think we've paid for external consultants maybe like $20,000 for about a week, for 5 days, and to do like hands-on training or something like this. So I can't give you like an exact, how much does it cost, but I give you some ideas in terms of how much it costs in terms of time, and then big ticket items if you can afford them.
Yeah, it's helpful to get that perspective. And so I think one of the things that a lot of people that are starting new champions programs struggle with is by the time you get to that 4th month of that monthly meeting, I think the first 3 months are easy because you got there's lots of excitement, right? You've got people. How do you keep the agenda both full and interesting in a monthly meeting a year after the Champions program has launched? Because I think a lot of people struggle with that. And that's why a lot of these programs, we kind of alluded to it earlier, the fact that a lot of these programs, in my experience with the program I picked up at Cisco, I ran Cisco's Champions program. I picked it up from it was on life support. I mean, it was doing that little blip across the screen. Like it was flatlining. I picked it up, and this was the 3rd time it had gone through an iteration of people got really excited. People spent a lot of time on it. That person left, and bloop, the whole thing went down to the flatline. The second person picked it up. I was the 3rd person. So a lot of people are going through these same type of things. And so from your perspective on that monthly meeting, how are you filling up that agenda, making it where people are like, I got to be there. This is must-see webinar time. I don't want to miss it.
Yeah, I think this is a really common issue, especially with the people that I've talked to. And actually, to be fair, though, there's something to be said for, if you are rotating through people and you do a big spike and you do some great things and then it levels off for a while and then you revisit and do some other good stuff, that can be a legit way to run a program. It is kind of quite different, but kind of circling back to your question, I think I mentioned this in when I was giving my presentation at the last conference. Repeatable but not repetitive is really, really important, because repeatable means it keeps costs down, keeps efforts down, and also means that you can delegate, so you have a mature process. I think treating it like a service where you need to build a process around it, something that works and is scalable and doesn't cost the earth in terms of hundreds of hours. That's just kind of like the business side of building a mature security champions program. You've got to treat it like you would any other service. And the repetitive side is kind of tricky. So again, this depends on your organization. So for me, I'm very lucky. We have a big security team, and we have a number of sections in our team. So we have a section who deals with monitoring, incident response. We have a team dedicated to penetration testing. We have teams dedicated to like DevSecOps, security engineering. We have a team of architects. And so basically what I do is I rotate through those teams and I say, okay, like, we do basically a quarterly rotation. So once a month, the SOC knows that on the 4th month of every quarter, so like April, for example, they know that they're expected to give like an update on the current threat landscape, an update on incidents that they can share, insights and tips for developers. And doing a presentation once per month or a talk or a deep dive on something is not that difficult. If you say, hey, once per quarter, you need to present, there you go. They can do that. And then, the next month, okay, pen testers, you need to report on findings or changes to the service or gives developers some insight into, hey, how can you prepare so that, you have a better pen test, better being like in quotes, I mean, less vulnerabilities or things like this. So the burden of that is suddenly much, much lower because the responsibility is spread much wider or much, much more widely. And nobody can say, I didn't realize, I forgot I've got this meeting next week. It comes up once per quarter, and, creating 30 minutes of content once per quarter. If you don't have something interesting to talk about for 30 minutes once per quarter, maybe you're not doing some very exciting things, if that makes sense. That's kind of unfair, because obviously some teams are very they're just doing operations, but they can talk about projects and findings and feedback and all sorts of things. So I lean on the fact that I have other teams who have bought into the Security Champions initiative to basically support that content. And I suspect it's much like running a podcast, where you reach out to different people or different people with different experiences, and that helps you create content so that you don't run out of things to talk about. And by the time a year passes, for us, a lot has changed. We might have a whole brand new service. The threat landscape may be very different. Technology changes so fast. And also we do sometimes have security champions themselves come and talk. They'll talk about an experience that they've done or something that they've changed. A good example is as part of my one of my training sessions, we talk about auditing access permissions, particularly for teams that are working with public cloud environments, making sure that they review their access controls. And one of our security champions basically took that, built a process within his team, automated a lot of it, and basically once per month, it grabs all of the permissions, produces a nice report. He runs through it with the manager and is like, yes, no, yes, no, yes, yes, this person left, remove all of these that are still there. And then did a talk at our security champion meeting, a 15, 20-minute talk about it. And now slowly other teams are also adopting the same process. And the original process there is, it's a little bit hard-coded, a little bit janky. It works for his team, but they're obviously collaborating, taking that idea and now and implementing that. And I think those are some of the things that that we really lean on to make sure that it's not just the same content. And I think when I arrived and originally started to take over the program, it was just, we'd have a monthly meeting and it'd be like, please don't forget to do your, submit for penetration tests. Please don't forget to do this. And, and everybody was obviously just the numbers were dwindling and things like this. Yeah. So that's basically how we made it work. And we get really, really high attendance every month, which is great to see. And so people type in the chat, because we have, hundreds of people attending, it is a bit more like webinar lecture style. But we do still get interaction. And we always have a Q&A, and we always get questions at the end, which is really, really good to see. Because if people don't ask questions, then they're probably busy checking their emails and stuff like that. But people are listening if they're asking questions. So.
Yeah, and I love that idea, the concept here. I think this is something that other people can take away and learn from this conversation. Look at different areas within the security team as potential speakers on a schedule to share the things that they're seeing, and everybody's seeing something interesting once a quarter. There's something they can talk about. It may be something in the industry. The incident response team may talk about something that's happening in the industry that isn't even impacting your own company, but it's something that's on their radar because they were at a conference and they heard somebody do a keynote on it, So I love that idea about kind of spreading the load across the security team and letting everybody come and you end up with a champions organization and a set of champions that really knows how security works inside the business because they know, I heard Jane talk about this from this other part of this, the risk team or something, telling us about this, how it all comes together. So I think that's a really powerful concept there. So from let's talk tactically or specifically about individual champions now. What have you seen? What kind of highlights do you have about individual contributions you've seen? I know you just mentioned one where, where this individual was able to share how they were doing, identity and access management at the cloud level, and it was a collaborative thing. But what other big contributions have you seen that have really made you proud of the champions that you're working with?
Yeah. So, one that really comes to mind is for training. So I'm sure a lot of people can sympathize with this, where people don't get into security because they want to be public speaking, for example, or giving training or whatever. Obviously, a lot of engineers, don't like being in the limelight, and that's okay, because we need, obviously people from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different skills. And actually, our security training has two challenges. One is having specialist knowledge. So obviously, I deliver a lot of security training in terms of application security. But for example, if it comes to Android, iOS, it's not my area of expertise. And so I don't really have any business teaching iOS developers, Android developers, how to do security. I could probably tell them the basics and be like, watch out for this, or use this tool to scan. So what we started to do is basically partnering with security champions who are an expert in a certain area. So, for example, one of our expert iOS developers, they would team up with one of our penetration testers or security auditors who had experience pen testing mobile applications, and together they would basically create the content. So the security champion in this case, having obviously a deep knowledge of the technology stack, and having the penetration tester support them, or the security engineer support them in terms of what common threats they see, what kind of findings we have, and then them working together to build the training and deliver it. That's really, really good. And not just from a collaboration and community, it's also kind of like free resource for my team that's responsible for cybersecurity training. In the I'm getting experts to come in and support our training activities. So this has been really, really valuable for us, especially for topics, like I say, that we don't necessarily have a specialist engineer or somebody with really, really deep knowledge in that area. We can collaborate with those security champions, or collaborate with the organization. And this is kind of our default training now. So our default training used to be, security engineers would deliver the training. But I think having, again, developers own the training and having us support them is going back to, again, democratizing AppSec, shifting left, and getting people, making them feel really like they're part of security, and security is part of their work. It's not just something that we're telling them to do. So when their colleagues, they see, my colleague is delivering this security training, that's part of their world. It's not part of our world anymore, if that makes sense. So this is probably one of the biggest things that I think that I started doing with our security champions community, and it's had really, really big impact, and it's done wonders for our training catalog. Our training has expanded quite rapidly because suddenly we have access to expertise that we didn't have before, or it would take us a really long time to research, build, learn, and deliver. So that's been really, really good.
And that's, I think, is a very powerful connection between training programs and champions programs. So previously to Security Journey, like I mentioned, I was running Cisco's Security Champion program, but I was also running the internal education program. And the champions, just like you're describing, were my feeders for my content, my subject matter experts on various topics, because I know what I know what I'm good at. I can bring things together, but just like you're describing, I needed people that had subject matter expertise. We were doing content on hardware security. I don't know anything about hardware security. I know enough to be dangerous about hardware security, not enough to do a 15-minute segment on it. But I brought some people into the conversation and had them help. And so I think there's got to be a good collaboration. And when I think training programs, the training program for me is bigger than the champions program, but the champions are a foundational piece, and they're also my target for how am I of pushing my envelope as high as I can to give them as much knowledge and experience and whatnot about security. Because I don't know if you've had this experience yet, but I've had some people that came through my champions program, went through the training programs, came through the champions programs, and then they said, I'm going to be a security person now. I'm not going to be a developer anymore. And they transitioned into AppSec. And like, for me, that's something that like, that's a happy moment. That makes me smile to think this program enabled some people to pick a different career path and go and chase a passion that they found that they had for this topic of security. And so I think that's really the value of bringing these two things together.
Yeah, definitely. And we found the same where a few people within the security champions community have been, real advocates for security and doing really, really great things. And some of them obviously, like you said, kind of considering more of a career in security now, or others are just being kind of like almost like a security specialist, but still, sitting in their current role. They're like the security guy on their team, which is really nice to see. Yeah.
It's a fun part of our jobs to see that come together.
One last thing we do with our training, just on that. So when we onboard people, we go through like our orientation training, and we have some other stuff as well, welcome stuff. We also do run a certified security champions training or set of training, which sounds confusing because like, hey, you're a security champion, but you're not a certified security champion. But naming conventions aside, this is because of our internal kind of like certifications. We basically run 5 days of training where we cover like a much deeper dive on threat modeling. So afterwards, security champions basically should be able to run a threat modeling session on their own. We do a couple of days of DevSecOps security automation, but on the sec side, obviously, like the dev and the ops side, not so much, but automating security tools and dealing with them. And then we do a day of secure development. And after that, they get an official like certification from our HR team, which is great because thinking about like the two-way street, obviously they're giving us time and effort and making their applications more secure. If you give somebody a certification, which they can take back to their manager and say, hey, I've achieved this, and they can put that onto either write that into their goal setting, objective setting, or have that as part of their evaluation, you're giving back to them as well. So I think providing evidence of training attendance, training completion, contributions to the security champion program, people who deliver training for us, people who do talks, making sure that you communicate that back to their manager, and making sure that the security champion can make the most of that in terms of that evaluation at work also helps as well. So wherever you have an opportunity to give them something, we should always try and jump on that, because I think a lot of times people contribute and then they're kind of like, you don't want any unsung heroes. You want lots of heroes who are, sung about or talked about. I often email managers or give feedback and say, hey, so-and-so has contributed to this. This has been really great. They did a talk here, or they've achieved this training, and their manager's then aware. And it's not coming from the security champion. It's coming from, somebody in the cybersecurity team. So myself, I'm a manager. It's coming from like another manager who, I think it's important to have that kind of recognition. And that's the word I was looking for is recognition is really, really important if you want to keep people on board. And to be fair, it's only fair, like giving people recognition for their work, that should be default. So we shouldn't forget about that.
Yeah, I don't know. You might have noticed I've been sitting here smiling for the last 30 seconds or so. If you ever have a chance to hear one of the talks I do on Security Champions, it's going to be eerie for you, because you and I think so much alike on these things. Like I say this, like I'm listening to you, I'm like, I say the same thing he's saying. Like recognition, of course, we email the managers and we do it. Like, so yeah, I mean, I love it because I'm learning I've learned a number of different things from you that I haven't thought about, but there's also a lot of things that like you and I we're aligned as far as how we're going to the business with these things and what we're prioritizing there. So, couple more questions here. Probably the one we should start with if we had executives listening, how to track ROI on things like training and security champions. That would have been the one question they would have been waiting for. That's the only one I showed up for was the return on investment. So, what are your thoughts on return on investment for champions and training?
Yeah, so the easy things to track are, if you're just launching a program or if you're in those early stages, and obviously tracking participation is good, creating those basic reports, making sure that you have that in place so you can say, hey, look, we are getting participation. The things we're doing are working. But beyond that, you do need to think about, okay, what processes do I need to put in place? What data do I need to access? And really, there are obviously a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that impact these, but looking at time to remediation for vulnerabilities, looking at service usage for services that your team provide that are not mandatory, you might see like an uptick. So for example, we promote a scanner. We'll obviously look at, okay, how many tickets have come in regarding that. We even track our internal pages. So if somebody comes to our knowledge base, what are they looking at? How many page views are we getting? And when we launch new services or advertise new services, we look at, okay, what's the uptick in terms of scanner usage? What's the uptick in terms of people looking at our knowledge base and looking at those sections? Kind of a side note, all of the scanning services that we provide took a little bit of work, but every time a developer uses one of our scanners, it basically checks in, so we can see like usage over time. It's very easy for our managed scanners, but the ones where we just provide a Docker image, it doesn't pull any data. It just says, hey, I'm scanning a service, or I've been used a few times this month. So we can actually get some reasonable insight into what the usage of our open source or like packaged open source tools are. So those are some of the kind of things that you can put into a report, and you can say, okay, over time, we've seen a reduction in time to remediation. We've seen a reduction in open vulnerabilities, for example, or the average number of findings over time. And you obviously need to look at, okay, security champions is probably not the only thing that's happening. But you can do some really interesting analysis, especially if you're having new teams and new services. Services over time with repeat testing tend to get better. You pen test once, you find a ton of stuff. You pen test twice, you find less, and then you kind of like, less findings over time. So the time from getting to a service that has lots of open vulnerabilities or is in a pretty immature state, and there's many ways to measure that, to time to being, let's say, compliant or ready for release, over a number of years, you can track that. I know that's quite difficult to do, and you need a lot of data and you need a lot of insights, but that's kind of what you should be aiming for long term. And don't wait 2 years to be like, now we're going to start looking at time to remediation, or now we're going to start looking at scanner or service usage. Put it in early, and even if they don't give you the insights you need straight away, in a year's time, that data is going to be really, really valuable. So I suppose collecting data, putting those processes in place is really, really important. And you can do other things like tracking tickets, tracking questions, especially if you have something like a chatbot or some kind of messaging service where you're answering questions. You can do some analysis on the number of questions you get. Previously, you might have had, 50 inquiries a month about penetration testing. And, you recognize, we're getting asked the same questions again and again. You launch your security champions program, you do training with them, suddenly the inquiries drop. You can attribute that to your security champions program. That's going to save you time, save you money, unless, again, you have a chatbot and that's handling it all, then obviously you're not saving time. But as kind of like as a basic example. So a lot of this really depends on your setup. Depends on your organization, depends what services you're providing. But there are many, many ways to basically track how mature are our target, how our target audience is, and what's the impact over time of our Security Champions program as it changes, as it grows. And again, you can look at specifics if you want to. So if you are pushing for teams to implement a certain tool, you can then look at that data. But you've got to start collecting the data early. Don't roll out the tool and then be like, we need all this data later on, and be like, we don't have it. So that sucks. So we can't prove the return on investment, for example. A really good one to look at is a lot of the time we talk about it's cheaper to find a vulnerability during the development stage rather than finding it as you're trying to release or after release. Now that sounds obvious to us, but if you do have something like Jira, where you're tracking all of your backlog and everything, you can look at, okay, how long does a item in the backlog take if it's discovered at a late stage of the development process, rather than something that's brought up during development. And you can do comparisons on those things, and then you can look at how your Security Champions program is impacting the overall whereas vulnerabilities are being discovered, basically. So are more of them being discovered earlier in the development lifecycle rather than later on. So you're kind of looking at two different points and then comparing the two. So there's no easy way to kind of like track ROI, but there is a lot of data that you can use to support your argument. And if you are using Jira and tickets very closely and tracking hours and things like that, it's quite easy to pull out, okay, this has saved us on average 10 hours per sprint or something like this per engineer. You can start to get that data, but it does take a bit of work.
Yeah. Wow. I feel like you've given us a $100,000 consulting engagement here on building security champions. And, I'm going to go back and actually listen to my own interview once we release this, because there's so many things that you've shared in this interview about how to do champions successfully and strategies and things like that. So this has been super valuable, and I look forward to doing a follow-on conversation where we can dive deeper onto the training side, because I'd love to get that appreciation for that as well. So from a key takeaway perspective now, so let's kind of summarize for our audience here. What do you think are some key takeaways that you would offer to our audience? Are there things that you would suggest they do, or how would you leave this conversation with them?
So I think from me, I would say, having learned from a lot of mistakes, some of the key things that if you're thinking about you want your Security Champions program to be successful, orientation and training, you've got to have that on points. That really, really helps. Otherwise, confused people won't turn up. Making people part of your community. Our monthly meeting, I think once I revamped it, became very successful. And I think the shared responsibility for that and the variety of topics is really, really important. Recognition, which I don't think I mentioned before. Obviously, we did talk about recognizing people who had done the training and contributed to the program, but our Security Champions is an official title. So if you look somebody up in our work directory, you will also see them. They will have an official title of Security Champion as well. So that helps. And I think avoiding, so for me, some of the harder lessons we had, newsletters didn't really work for us. That was kind of a complete waste of time. Security Champion Awards is a controversial one because recognition is very important. But when you have let's say 10 people who all do amazing things year on year, it's hard to be diverse in terms of your awards. So think very carefully about when you start to do awards, if you want to keep it running long term, you're going to have to figure out there's always going to be some like A-star students or people who are like really, really good. And obviously you want to reward them, but at the cost of everybody else, it can be difficult. So just think carefully. And I think make sure your security champions, things that they do are shared within the community. So the training that our security champions contribute to, the new processes in terms of like I spoke about before, where we look at access control processes and things like that, and that's become more widely adopted. And collect tons and tons of data, and make sure that you can, when you're ready to do the analysis, that you're not just stuck and then be like, we need to wait 6 months before we have something meaningful. Try and get in early. Even if it's just basic stats, basic usage stats, basic attendance. If you're running a monthly meeting, make sure you keep those numbers, because if they trend upwards or trend downwards, that's going to tell you something, right? So you can act on this information. And even for me now, I know that running a security champion meeting on a Monday afternoon, on a Friday afternoon is not a good idea. And there are some other things, some regional differences where we needed to figure out time zones and other kind of large tech meetings that happened within our organization. So even just getting the timing right was a real something that we couldn't do without the data. So yeah, it's really, really important to track those things.
Yeah. Alex, thank you so much for sharing this very wide large amount of information about your experiences. I think it's so powerful when we can share those stories with other people. And my hope is that what you've shared today is going to encourage somebody out there right now who's like, I have to start this champions program and I don't know what I'm going to do. And they're going to listen to this and go, I've got ideas now. I know Alex said that if I do this, or this worked and this didn't. So I think this is really powerful. So definitely look forward to a follow-on conversation. I think you and I could talk on this topic and many others probably for most of the day. But because our listeners have to go back to work or driving their car or whatever they're doing right now, we'll stop now, and we will definitely pick this up in a part 2 at some point in the future. So Alex, thanks for being a part of the podcast. Great.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I really hope that some people learned from our mistakes as well as, things that worked out. So it's great. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Definitely. Thank you.